All right, folks, what's up? Antonio Fletcher back with you once again. This is going to be a hangout about intrinsic worth. A discussion with an atheist inspired this particular hangout. And what I want to do here is I want to screen share a conversation I had with atheists in my last, the Lifeline hangout. I'm going to show you the conversation we had and the context which led up to this. So I just got to prepare my screen share here, and then I have it ready to go for you in just a second. So let's arrange a few things here. Hopefully, you all can see my screen right now. Um, what I'm doing here is I'm just showing you a conversation real quick that we all had. I believe you can all see. Let me see here. That's my background right there. Okay, here we go. Um, all right. So I was talking to Bina Berry here. He says, and excuse me, abortion is an option, the fact that not all life is worth living. And then I say, well, maybe one day you'll be able to come in and actually back that up. You seem to think worth is subjective. What actually makes your life worth the living? And he says, value is objective. That seems incoherent. And then I say, why don't you actually answer my question instead of shifting with a question? What actually makes your life worth the living? He says, it's obvious to me value is subjective unless you can show how value is independent of the subjective. Does gold have intrinsic value? How could it? Gold is gold. Value is not a feature of it, but added to it. What actually makes your life worth living? I asked him. He says, I choose to live rather than die because for the most part, I enjoy it. If I didn't enjoy it, then life wouldn't be worth living. To live just for the sake of it has no value, but ultimately does more harm than good. I said, I asked you what makes your life worth living. I didn't ask you why you choose to live. Actually, deal with the questions I asked you before I block you for wasting my time. And he responds saying, I choose to live rather than to die because, for the most part, I enjoy it. If I didn't enjoy it, then life wouldn't be worth the living. To live just for the sake of it has no value, but ultimately does more harm than good. So I am saying things that give me joy, makes my life worth living. You just repeat the same answer to a question I didn't ask you. If you do it again, you're getting blocked. I asked you what makes your life worth living, not why you choose to live. These are two different questions. And he says, I'll try again. Wife, family, joy of learning, exploring the world, my job. So I ask him, and who define those things which you say make life worth living? You or someone else? He says, I ultimately decide what I enjoy, but there's also evidence to support. For example, some marriages are harmful to people and society or some birth defects make life extremely difficult and harmful. So to answer both subjective and objective pathways to find those things. As we are deciding the fate of another, we need to consider those facts for them. Really, we need to be men and make tough decisions sometimes. So I said, so you ultimately decide what makes your life worth living, yet you claim worth is subjective. If worth is subjective, then anyone can say your life is nothing worth living and take your life right now. And I just told him to focus on one thing at a time. So he says, he laughs out loud and says, how is the above inconsistent? That's perfectly consistent. If I decide that it is, if I decide that sorry about that. If I decide that it is subjective, so yes, it's subjective. And he responds to my comment saying, yes, they're called murders. You're not challenging my position in any way. All you're doing is restating it. Please offer a refutation. I didn't say you were inconsistent. See what I mean about getting ahead of yourself and attacking straw man fallacies? So he says, so I respond to his murderous comment, and I just says, worth is subjective. Who are you to call them murderers? So he says, why didn't we state the obvious if you didn't intend to make any point? By definition, a murderer is a murderer, and the worth of being a murderer is considered detrimental to the well-being of society, which is both subjective and intersubjective. So I said, who says I didn't intend to make a point? Seems like you're getting yourself ahead of yourself again. Try to follow along. And I quote his comment here and I ask him, what do you mean by definition? By your definition or someone else's definition? So then he says, well, make the point. And then he responds to my question. Definitions evolve due how society uses words. I am referring to the generally held definition of what it is meant by murderer. Any more questions before you make a point? In there, patience is a virtue. And I respond to his comment and I said, so it's by definition, society defines. So it's by the definition society defines. Does society also define whether your life has worth or not? And then he says, yes, murderers in some states, some state countries are sentenced to death. Hence their worth is determined by the state, who is determined by its constituents. That's how democracy works, does it not? So once again, you didn't address the question. All you did was give an analysis of government in regards to murder. Does society define whether your life has worth or not? I should not have to explain to you why this is a separate question from how the government defines murder. I clearly answered your question with yes. Then I gave an explanation. Did I answer your question, yes or no? And I just tell him, no, you did not. You spoke about how the government handles the issue of murder and murderers. That's quite a separate question of whether society determines whether your life has worth or not. Since you can't seem to follow a conversation very carefully, let me spell it out for you. You haven't murdered anyone or done anything wrong. Now, does society determine whether your life has worth or not? There's no possible way you can miss following the conversation at this point. He says, before we continue, you asked me, does society also define whether your life has worth or not? I responded, yes. So ignore my explanation. I answered your closed question with a yes, correct? And I just responded to him saying that people are being sentenced to death for murder has nothing to do with the value of one's life. but of the consequence for the crime committed. A murderer isn't sentenced to death because his life isn't valuable, but because the punishment fits the crime. Again, you're not addressing what I asked you at all. So, no, you did not, in fact, address the question I asked you because I did not, in fact, ask you about how government treats those who commit crimes. So, let's try this again. You haven't murdered anyone or done anything wrong. Now, does society determine whether your life has worth or not? And I once again state there's no possible way you can miss following along the conversation at this point. And then he says, again, I say ignore my explanation and accept the yes or to your question so we don't go down the rabbit hole question. Because it was really the same question. I didn't ask him another question. But anyway, he says the answer is yes, society decides my worth even if I've done nothing wrong. You have a job, then not your employer decide whether you have worth to an employee. Oh, doesn't did not your employer decide whether you have worth to your employee? I guess that's what he meant to say. So again, yes, society decides if you have worth. And of course, I call him out for equivocation. So I was saying you're confusing extrinsic worth with intrinsic worth. How you're worth as if you are an asset to an employer and not in no way relates to how your very life is worth. Follow along. There's a little something called context. I know you are not stupid and I'm fully aware of what I'm talking about. Things like this show why you've repeatedly done terrible in this conversation. Let's try this yet again. You haven't murdered anyone or done anything wrong. Now, does society determine whether your life has worth or not? There's really a possible way you can miss following along the conversation at this point. He says, I reject intrinsic worth, therefore I don't confuse the two. How it could be equivocating. I've already stated worth is subjective, thus intrinsic worth doesn't fit my position. All worth comes from mine is my position. Any clearer? I project worth onto things as others project worth onto me. My position is again worth is extrinsic. Worth is determined by contest and contrast by minds. Again, if I haven't murdered anyone, then my worth is still subjectively, extrinsically determined by minds, whether my own mind or other minds or a collective of minds. I hope this is clear. Intrinsic value is mind independent, which is absurd in my view. So he rejects, rejects intrinsic worth, and then I tell him, oh, but you cannot say why anyone shouldn't kill you right now by rejecting intrinsic worth. That's the problem with your position. The person who chooses to kill you right now doesn't see any intrinsic worth in your life. Unless you believe society has the right to take your life whenever society chooses for any or no reason, you cannot actually rationally reject intrinsic worth. And then he says, of course I can say why anyone shouldn't kill me right now. I don't need intrinsic worth to do so. All I need for me is to have a sense of worth that is because I feel I have worth or others feel I have worth. The sense isn't innate or inherent. It is developed and projected onto things. As I have stated, things do not have intrinsic worth, meaning worth without minds projecting that. So, no problem with my position. You have not shown how there is one. All you have done is point to how things are and say it's a problem and why it is a problem. You need to explain how a thing has intrinsic worth independent of a mind. And he responds to my comment, and he says exactly because intrinsic worth Intrinsic value is to say things have worth independent of minds. How is that possible? Further, even if, but some reasoning, there is intrinsic worth yet to be shown by me. How does that stop someone from killing me? Is excuse me. If that is an argument, then it is clearly false because people get murdered all the time. If we have this innate worth, then it accounts for nothing. But regardless, one makes it no difference or causes no problem for my position. And if you believe it does, please show how. So far, you have stated it is a problem, and I've shown it isn't. And then I respond to him saying, so when society, for example, feels you don't have worth, society can simply take your life if you have nothing wrong, not done anything wrong. But anyway, if there is no intrinsic worth, then society in no way has to respect your life. It can simply take it on a whim if society wishes to do so. You still haven't defeated intrinsic worth. You've just shown that living your life is in the hands and control of others, regardless of whether you've actually done anything wrong or not. And intrinsic worth doesn't say that people won't attempt to take your life. Intrinsic worth says your life ought to be respected and not unjustly infringed upon, regardless of whether one person or society as a whole says so. Not intrinsic worth doesn't protect you. And he responds by saying, so your supporting argument for intrinsic worth is if one believes society doesn't have the right to take my life whenever it chooses, then intrinsic worth is true. How does what one believe give us any truth? Just because you believe society doesn't have the right doesn't make intrinsic worth true. That is just your belief. Please not rationally justify it for belief as true. Also, what do you mean by right? In some countries, say dictatorships, or take ISIS, for example, do they have the right to kill who they choose? What does it mean to have the right? In that sense, right just means power. ISIS has the power to take life where they choose. If intrinsic value exists, what effect does it have? No, ISIS decides what value and not value and acts accordingly. So it's best not to live near ISIS if you want to live as your intrinsic worth counts for nothing. And my response was, you do realize your entire point is self-refuting, right? How does what you believe about rejecting intrinsic worth make non-intrinsic existence true? Now, please rationally justify your belief as true. This sad attempt at a refutation cuts both ways. And responding to his point about ISIS, I said, all this amounts to is that there are people in this world who will not respect intrinsic worth. It isn't a defeater for intrinsic worth. In a non-intrinsic world, there is no basis in which anyone has to respect your life. In an intrinsic world, there is such a basis. Fine, I'm not really sure, but basically, for now, I'm just gonna do some commentary on this whole thing. Um, this issue when people who reject intrinsic worth and saying, "Oh, well, it's about what other people say, or it's about what I project." Um, the problem with that whole idea is just what I said. Is that well, all of society can just say that your life isn't worth anything and just kill you if they wish. So society doesn't have to respect your life. And he's got the wrong idea about what intrinsic worth is talking about. Intrinsic worth doesn't say that people won't try to kill you. Intrinsic worth says that despite the fact that people try to kill you, um, the fact that people will try to kill you given the worth you have, um, there are serious consequences for doing such a thing. If your life has no value whatsoever, have no intrinsic worth at all, then there is no reason to give consequences to your life. There's no reason to punish anyone who takes your life. If nothing else, you rejecting intrinsic worth is just you just arbitrarily just saying that people shouldn't be able to kill you. You just kind of just pulling out the sky. You're not really appealing to anything intrinsic. You're not really um, arguing any reason why people should not take your life. The only thing it comes down to is oh, harming others is bad. Well, who says you rejected intrinsic worth? Who or it's not beneficial? Well, who says you sat up here and rejected intrinsic worth? You have no basis to say what is bad or non-beneficial. You just pulling that out the sky. There's no reason why anyone should respect your life. There's no reason why anyone should not be able to take your life whenever they want. So what if you give yourself extrinsic worth? So what if society gives you extrinsic worth? What's given, on an extrinsic basis can be taken away on an extrinsic basis. So when you have inherent intrinsic worth, that means that one individual or society has any right to infringe upon your life. And he says, what value does it have? Well, it has a significant value. The value of it states that by virtue of you being a person, by virtue of you having such a worth within you, your life must be respected. It has significant worth. Now, I don't respect another person because of extrinsic worth. I respect another person because of their intrinsic worth. I may hate that person's guts. I may not give a crap about anything this person does in their life, but I have to respect their life. And if society said today that society does not have to respect this person's life, let's call this person X. If society said today, right now, that nobody in society has to respect the life of person X, I would still respect the life of person X because of their intrinsic worth, of their intrinsic value. I would still respect their life regardless. Person who denies intrinsic worth does not have to respect their life. And in fact, whether society says so or not, they have no basis in which to have an ought to respect their life. Now, we can debate about what the basis for this intrinsic worth is, I believe the basis for intrinsic worth is in the person of Jesus Christ. That is my basis for intrinsic worth. What I'm arguing here is not so much the basis for intrinsic worth, but the, the recognition that intrinsic worth exists. Unfortunately, you left in a circle of, well, society must value your life, or if you are lucky for society to value your life, then your life will be respected. But if society doesn't value your life, then it doesn't matter whether you value your life subjectively or not. If society doesn't value your life, you can you're just a goner. It is not a defeater for intrinsic worth, because you have societies like ISIS. This is precisely why the overwhelming majority of the world recognizes ISIS as the uh, sick um, organization, the sick religious based entity that it is. I mean, what is the real basis for um, anyone respecting your life? I mean, ex- intrinsic worth says whether an individual, it doesn't matter whether society, it doesn't matter whether anyone says your life is not worth anything. You have to respect that person's life. As I said, even for the person who denies intrinsic worth, even if society said, look, we don't have to respect your life, I would still say that that person's life should be respected because of the very worth of that individual, of their inner worth, not because society just said, you know what, you don't matter anymore. Anybody can take your life if they wish. That would still be wrong. Intrinsic worth says something like that is wrong. Denying, uh, deny intrinsic worth, and you just say that it's just what subjectively people project, then you have no basis for your life to be respected. It's funny that those who reject intrinsic worth seem to think that there is some sort of significance, and they treat their life as some sort of intrinsic thing, even when they reject intrinsic worth, because their actions are not consistent with their claims. It's easy to say that, well, intrinsic worth doesn't exist, but do you really live that way? Of course not. Nobody who denies the intrinsic worth of an individual consistently lives that way with that worldview. To live that way, to deny intrinsic worth, and to live as if your life has meaning, it's just absolutely baseless. Or to live as if other people giving it meaning or yourself giving it meaning is absolutely baseless. here's the problem with the whole idea about denying intrinsic worth. If what other people give is the basis for worth, if what other people give is the basis for worth, then why accept that is the basis of worth rather than it doesn't matter who gives or who takes it away? Your life is still worth respecting. So let's look at it like this. You're juggling two bases of worth here. You have one side that says worth is what other people give it. The other side says worth is independent of what other people give it. Which one do you want to accept? Which one would you say respects your life more? The one which is which states that your life ought to be respected regardless of what anyone says, society or individuals, or the one which says that it's all about what other people say about you that determines your life has value or not? See, it's easy to claim that, society projects value onto you and as far as your life is concerned. And if that society takes life away from you, then you don't have value. But the problem is, like, when you look at places like ISIS, everyone who knows that ISIS do those kind of things to be a sick, foul entity which ought to be pounded into the depths of hell. People understand that those people are sick, twisted bastards. And that's a drastic understatement. They don't sit up here and be like, well, they deny or they well, worth is, extrinsic, worth is subjective. But those people are bastards anyway. Yes, we project worth onto people, and this is what society says. But, what they're doing is not that big of a deal. You're going to say it's about what society projects onto you, which is what he was saying. But you didn't have a problem with society. You see the inconsistency there? He clearly has a problem with the society that runs things. ISIS is the ruler in that particular society. So you're going to use society for a basis and then have a problem with that society. You can't use a society for a basis if you are going to deny that society, because he clearly thinks he acknowledges that that is the way people, that's the way ISIS does things over there, but he also acknowledges that what they're doing is wrong. Just because they don't say it's wrong over there doesn't mean it's not actually wrong. So he is indirectly acknowledging an inherent, an intrinsic worth of value there. He doesn't have to explicitly say it, but the fact that you would even have a problem with ISIS at all, you can't consistently find a problem with what ISIS is doing and yet deny intrinsic worth at the same time. Oh, it's just my subjective opinion that what they're doing to their people is wrong. Well, if it's really your subjective opinion, then what makes your subjective opinion any more right or wrong than theirs? Than their subjective opinion that they're not doing anything wrong? What makes your basis more right or wrong than theirs? If you acknowledge, well, there is no more right or wrong basis than theirs, then you can't complain. You have no rational basis to complain. I find it so funny when people deny intrinsic worth, when people deny uh, objective moral values and duties. That really is hilarious to me because you can find that every time people who do these things do not live consistently with their claims. People who deny objective moral values and duties, people who deny intrinsic worth, they do these sorts of things because it makes it easier to justify their sin, to justify things they support, like abortion or other sorts of sins that they commit in their lives. They need, but the problem is, again, like I'm not really discussing so much the basis for objective moral values and duties and intrinsic worth, but but the fact that it exists. And the problem is that even there are even atheists out there who will even acknowledge that abortion is wrong. There are even atheists out there who will acknowledge that objective moral values and duties exist, that intrinsic worth exists. Now, I would say that they have no basis for these, for saying that intrinsic worth exists, and I would say they have no basis for objective moral values and duties, but at least they acknowledge they exist. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna invite a few people here and see if we can make this a more interesting conversation instead of me just talking um, in here on my own. So just give me a few minutes here, and then we'll see if anyone comes in. Yeah, I find it very interesting when you have these people who deny objective moral values and duties. They deny intrinsic worth, yet live like it exists. No matter who you are, no matter what you say, if you are a person who denies objective moral values and duties exist and deny things like intrinsic worth exists, you're not going to be able to consistently live like there is no such things. It's easy to um, argue in text chat to deny intrinsic worth or and to deny objective moral values and duties. It's easy to deny that in text chat. It's quite another thing when faced with real life to consistently stand by that very belief. Again, the reason why people would want to deny intrinsic worth and objective moral values and duties is because they want to justify uh, things that are absolutely wrong. They want to justify things like abortion. They want to justify a number of different sins in their life, like adultery, fornication. They want to deny these things. I mean, they want to justify these things by denying intrinsic worth, by denying objective moral values and duties. Going back to that conversation, that guy really has no basis for saying why anyone shouldn't kill them. It says, well, value is not independent of the mind. Well, it's all about what I project in my life and what others project in my life. Why should anybody respect the projection of the value you give onto yourself? Why should anyone respect? Why should society respect your life? That's the important question here. Is if you deny intrinsic worth exists, if you deny things like objective moral values and duties, then why should anyone respect your life? Why should anyone not be able to kill you if you've done nothing wrong? Why shouldn't anyone be able to just come up to you at any time and put a bullet in your head if you do not believe there's any such thing as intrinsic worth? These are questions people who deny intrinsic worth can't address. I can say why someone should be able to put a bullet in my head just anytime they please. I am an entity with intrinsic worth that you cannot violate that intrinsic value that I possess. Now we can have a separate conversation on what the basis for that intrinsic value is. What we're particularly interested in this hangout is just discussing whether it exists or not. I say that it is beyond uh, any reasonable denial that it is beyond any reasonable denial. Intrinsic value did I even say that right? I said beyond any reasonable denial. If I said that correct, but the point is, um, intrinsic value exists, and it's not merely because I simply uh, believe it. I think my moral experience, gives me more than enough basis that it does exist rather than the contrary. I would appeal to the argument William Lane Craig makes by saying that objective moral values and duties exist, and we can see this by an appeal to our moral experience. In the same way, my sensory experience can detect the um, objective physical world around me, and that I can trust my sensory experiences. I can trust my moral experiences that things like objective worth exist, intrinsic worth exists, objective moral values and duties exist. My sensory experience could be incorrect. We could be in the matrix. I could be in the matrix. But um, in the absence of any sound defeated from my sensory experience, I think I'm very well justified in trusting in my sensory experience to argue that the objective physical world around me exists. In the same way, in the absence of any defeater for intrinsic worth, objective moral values, and duties, I can trust my moral experience that intrinsic worth does exist, that each and every human being on this planet has the right to um, not have their life taken unjustly. And like he said earlier, he was talking about how well society put murderers on death row all the time and they don't respect their life. Like, no, sir, that has nothing to do with the worth of one's life. The reason why murderers get put on death row is because it's about whether the punishment fits the crime, not about the fact that their life is worthless. In fact, I would say that a society that would even allow a murderer to be on death row is respecting their life by the very fact that they don't just immediately just take their life. They have respect for their life, that they don't just outright just kill a murderer like immediately. In many cases, people are on death row for years and years at a time. I would say that that is a society which respects the life of anyone, including a murderer. So putting a murderer on death row is not saying that their life lacks value at all. Quite the opposite argument can be made and can very well successfully be made. There really is no basis for those who deny intrinsic worth, objective moral values and duties, there really is no basis for saying why anybody shouldn't do moral evils. It's just pretty much a fantasy that they are worth anything. It's just some fleeting fantasy that they pull out the sky of giving value that comes literally out of nowhere. When such a thing as intrinsic value, things like objective moral values and duties exist, that states that me as an individual ought to respect your life because of that intrinsic nature, because of your intrinsic being, by virtue of you um, being a person just like me, your life, your right not to be killed ought to be respected. There is no ought protective nature in an extrinsic worth the world and where society says that if your life doesn't matter, we can take it right now if we want. And appealing to people in places like ISIS isn't a defeater for intrinsic worth. If nothing else, it this is it's a great confirmation of it because the fact that people would mistreat people on such a level like they do under ISIS means that their conscience is triggered. Their conscience is challenged, and they try to suppress their conscience. They try to suppress the fact that they know what they're doing is wrong. They try to suppress the fact that um, the worth that they inherently know each and every human being has requires them to do vicious things to kill their conscience. It requires them to engage in the most heinous acts in order to suppress the conscience that they know is seeing deep inside of them somewhere that this person has value, this person has worth. It is my position that sick bastards like Hitler had millions of people wiped out, not simply because he found their lives worthless, but more because he knew inside their lives had tremendous worth, and he did everything he could to suppress his conscience of the worth he knew those people had. And when you are understanding the worth someone has, you will go over the top to fight against that. You will go over the top to suppress that. It's said quite a bit all the time. People are people want to hate against what they're afraid of. They want to hate against what they fear. They want to hate against what lives look meaningless. People who do the most vicious things to commit vicious crimes, to commit great moral wrongs, have taken their time to suppress their conscience. People like Hitler, people like Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Stalin, those people have taken vast amounts of time to suppress their conscience because you have to. It ain't because you, it ain't really because you reject the value these people have that you hate against, that you malicious or mercilessly want murdered. It's because you've taken the time to suppress your conscience and you've taken the time to suppress the value those people have. You could be a person who denies intrinsic worth all day. You're not going to be able to consistently live your life because whether you accept, excuse me, I mean to say, when you reject intrinsic worth and you saying, well, it's just all subjective, it's just all what I think, and it's about what others think on me. When you try to live that kind of life, I just don't think you can consistently do it. I just don't think you can um, find some way to resolve a non intrinsic existence with reality because, sorry, people, I'm getting a phone call. Hold on a second. Okay, I'm back. Let's see. Um, I don't know much more I can say about this. Is that people who give these bases and these arguments for denying intrinsic worth, they just don't consistently live their lives that way. Um, when you are walking around the corner and you see just a terrible thing happen, and you do whatever you can to um, stop that from happening, or to at least minimize the damage of what's going on by calling the police, by maybe intervening personally. There's something that just triggers you to action. It's not something you think about. What is this thing that triggers you to action? When you see something that you instantly perceive as just not right, you instantly perceive as this is really messed up, what's going on here? What is that thing that triggers you to action? There's some sort of inner essence, some sort of inner thing. You don't have to acknowledge it necessarily. I mean, at least not in this conversation. You don't even have to necessarily acknowledge it as God. I mean, that's what I would acknowledge it as. But again, I'm just arguing for the fact that this very thing exists. You see just vicious things happening, and you want to do what you can to minimize the damage, or if you see something bad about to happen and you have the power to stop it, why do you do so? It's not even something you think about. It's not even something that you be like, well, I don't see any intrinsic worth, but I'm just gonna react. I'm just no, that doesn't even cross people's minds. You can say all day things like intrinsic worth doesn't exist. You're not gonna consistently be able to live that way. You can say all day to where um, it's just my mind projecting value onto my life, or other people's minds projecting value onto my life, and it's the same for everybody. But what I find so funny about this sort of thinking is that they say, well, it's about the projection of other minds. Why do you think a mind, a collective of minds, is somehow authoritative? Like, well, society as a whole looks at your life as valuable, so your life is valuable for society as a whole does it. But if society as a whole doesn't look at your life as valuable, then tough beans. I mean, what's going to protect you? You have a family, and you and your family have done nothing wrong. and you're about to be executed. In a non intrinsic world, you have no basis for saying the life of you and your family should be respected. The world, you do have a basis for saying the family, your family, you and your family's life should be respected. I think the endless, the endless sort of mindset, the endless sort of um, attempt to argue that intrinsic worth doesn't exist is the supreme confirmation of it. It is my belief that what people are saying when intrinsic worth doesn't exist and when objective moral values and duties exist is my opinion that they're saying, well, that God doesn't exist. In my view, that's what they're really arguing against. They're arguing against God. They're not really arguing against intrinsic worth. It's just a way to get away from God. That's all it really is. Um, Although I said that um, I wasn't trying to necessarily discuss the basis for intrinsic worth, it is my opinion that ultimately the basis they are arguing against is just trying to get away from God. Each and every one of us on this earth has worth, whether anybody says so or not. Each and every one of us has the right for our life not to be taken unjustly, whether anybody says so or not. I was told that, well, you believe that intrinsic worth exists doesn't make it true. Well, that's true, but it cuts the opposite way too. Your belief that um, intrinsic worth does not exist doesn't make it true. So, what arguments do I give for intrinsic worth? Well, it's just like I said, I appeal to my moral experience. I believe it was Michael Ruse who said, the man who thinks, and I'm just paraphrasing, it was Michael Ruse or some other atheist, and I'm just paraphrasing. If I get the quote wrong or if I get the atheist wrong, you have to forgive me for that. But I believe it was Michael Ruse who said, the man who thinks it's okay to rape a little girl is just as mistaken as the man who thinks 2 plus 2 equals 5. Some things in this world are just really wrong, and it would be wrong whether anybody agrees or disagrees. And there are things like self sacrifice and a love a parent has for their children, things like this that are really good. They're not these simple, just fleeting whims that we give meaning, but things that really truly do exist in a sort of intrinsic way. These things have real existence, and I think our moral experience is very valid for justifying the um, likelihood these things exist more likely than the contrary. I think the immediate jump to action, as I said earlier, the immediate jump to action to do something when you see something really bad happening is the triggering of something going on with your inner being that's causing you to jump to action. It's just not something that's just merely subjective. And if if this whole triggering to do something about a bad situation was merely subjective, then why should anyone who witnessed such a bad thing, and if they had the power to do something, they see a bad thing happening and they have the power to stop it, to at least minimize what's going on by doing something, and if they don't do it, if this is merely subjective, then why should that person feel any shame or any remorse for not having done anything? Why not be able to just go about their day shameless for their lack of action, shameless that they didn't do anything to help? I think our more experience more tells us things are intrinsic than not. Just as our sensory experience revealed to us constantly that the physical world around us exists, that there is an objective reality around us. We have a particular trust with our sensory experience. In the same way, we can trust our moral experience. There's just something within us inherently that triggers when we have come across, when it's been put to our attention that some 30, 40-year-old bastard or so has raped an innocent little girl. Our moral, something within our very being triggers to just the sick nature of that whole thing. That is our intrinsic essence. That is our inner objective being set off that says this is wrong. And I don't think it's really merely a subjective reaction. It's not something that just happens on a whim. You have people who are vicious psychopaths or just people who are just really twisted, sick individuals in the head, which that would not affect somebody. But again, those are people with severe mental issues. They're psychotic. These people are just not normal individuals. Most normal people most normal people immediately react to a little girl getting tortured and raped by some sick bastard as horrifying. It's not something that we like, I mean, we just happen to give that value. We just happen to just, we're just giving that value. It's not really any value there. That dude ain't really doing nothing wrong. I mean, that dude ain't really truly raping that girl. He really ain't doing nothing wrong. We just kind of just throw value in it because, that's just what we do. We just arbitrarily just throw value at things. We just arbitrarily just say, yeah, that dude, was raping that little girl. We just kind of arbitrarily throw that out there. That's just absurd. Nobody truly believes that. At least when given the opportunity for someone to challenge them on it. You can typically find people don't consistently live like that or act like that. All these people give these explanations to argue against such things because the bottom line is they have things in their life that they do wrong that they want to justify. If it can ultimately get them away from a creator, if it can ultimately allow them to do whatever dirt they're doing in their personal life, then they're going to say, well, although in these things, these are really wrong. It's not really a big deal because intrinsic worth doesn't exist. Reject intrinsic worth. I reject objective moral values and duties. I just reject it all because, yeah, I'm going to see that raping the little girl's wrong, but I mean, it's not because it's objectively wrong, not because she has any intrinsic value, not because there's any significance there other than, just me giving her value and others giving her value for no reason or for no rational basis. I get the feeling that people just talk this way on the net to try to win arguments, not because, and they realize they believe there's no such thing as intrinsic nature. It's easy to talk a lot of nonsense on the net and to say that the raping and torturing of a little girl by some bastard is merely a subjective thing. It's easy to say that on the internet. Out in the real world, people don't live that way. Out in the real world, you would just sound like an absolute total moron arguing like that. And all they like to do is they'll appeal to psychopaths who don't find such things to be wrong. They'll appeal to societies in the past who have done messed up things. I find it very interesting, many of the main people who pride themselves on the progression of society from the Bronze Age past will go to the past and say, well, this is what people did in the past. They didn't find it wrong, so does that make it objectively wrong? But apparently, you think it was so wrong that you point to the past as if you felt like the past was um, more primitive to say that what these people were doing was just messed up. But if you really thought that what they're doing was that messed up, then why are you saying that it was merely a subjective thing? Clearly, you're talking about the progression of society, something that we cannot go back to or should not go back to. You're going to say, well, that was wrong in the past, but we're not going to go back to the past. We're going to move forward and progress. We should never go back to the past to where such things were accepted, and we should never go back. Then why would we never have to go back? There would be no objective reason not to go back to the past or to act like the past. There'd be no objective reason to do so. But you truly believe what happened in the past is wrong. You truly do believe that, and not just, oh, what was your opinion? Again, the challenge is for people to live consistently with the claims they make online. And I am convinced people, don't go into their personal lives and say, you know what, son, you know what, daughter, I love you, but your value is only subjective. Your value is only what other people give you. And if society says you are not valuable, and society forced me to give you up to for them to kill you, then I would just willingly give you up to society for them to kill you because I think what society says goes. I believe society is the arbiter for, or the basis arbiter for what worth is. No self respecting person would want to give their child up to a society to take their life if society was to say your child is no longer valuable, your child is not valuable in this society. And most people in society agree, and then they want to kill the kid. No self respecting person who's a parent or guardian want to give their child up to such a corrupt society. It's just all smoke and mirrors. Denying intrinsic worth is just smoke and mirrors. Live consistently with saying intrinsic worth doesn't exist. You find a way to um, explain why somebody who sees a crime happening and doesn't at least call the cops, you explain why that person should not feel any shame under your guise that intrinsic worth does not exist. That's what I'm saying, man. It's just so hilarious. And when people find these sorts of arguments actually valid, I mean, it's a shocking number of people who think stuff like objective moral values and duties don't exist and intrinsic value, intrinsic worth doesn't exist. It's an alarming number of people who find such things to be true, who think um, what morality is just merely subjective. It's nothing objective about it. But this whole argument about intrinsic worth sparked with Hangout, as I mentioned earlier. And it's interesting, he started out with saying, what did he say? Let me make sure I get the quote correct. He said, abortion as an option is to respect the fact that not all life is worth living. But it's funny. He says that his life is worth living because others and himself give it worth. But then he says abortion as an option is to respect the fact that not all life is worth living. But you admitting that you and others give your life worth means that whoever's life is not worth living is determined by other people, not you. Your argument not only works for abortion, it works for society to disrespect your life. So the implications behind rejecting intrinsic worth and value, the implications behind such a position, beauty. So it's really funny to me. He says that all life is not worth living. Well, what does that even mean? That all life is not worth living? What is the basis for that? What is the presupposition for that? He has to presuppose value is not inherent. He has to presuppose that uh, that worth um, isn't intrinsic. But he operates off this presupposition to justify abortion. Yet at the same time, I'm pretty sure he would think that it would be absolutely disgusting for society to just take out him and his family without any sort of just cause. So he'll say it's about abortion, it's about respecting the fact that all life is not worth living. Well, the implication in your position go way beyond abortion, sir. This is what I come across quite often with people who try to argue and justify abortion. They don't pay attention to how their arguments go beyond abortion. They arbitrarily apply um, they arbitrarily apply justifying abortion with this worth argument, but they know that if society used that exact same reasoning, if they just was to execute them and their family without any just cause, that they would be wrong. He says there is nothing, or he talks about, well, there's nothing intrinsic other than what minds project onto it. Well, then, sir, all minds will have to do is project that there is value for the unborn, there is value for life. But if he thinks it's just about the projection of what others do, then how could he argue whether abortion is right or wrong? How could he argue, or if he even argues right or wrong at all? Surely he believes that it would be wrong for society to take away a woman's right to get an abortion. Surely he would think that sort of that would be an unjust thing to do if society was like to make abortion illegal right now. Of course, if he don't think that's wrong and he thinks society is the basis for it, then he's basically going on along with society says. What society says goes. If society says abortion is wrong, then abortion is wrong. If society says abortion is not wrong, then abortion is not wrong. Then his position forces him to go along with what society thinks, not with his own ideas. Not have him think for himself. So yeah, people like this can say all day that intrinsic value doesn't exist or intrinsic work doesn't exist, but they can't consistently live that way. There is no reason he would find it right for a firing squad to kill him and his family for no reason. And they haven't done anything wrong. But this is exactly what his logic justifies. This is exactly the implications of his logic. There is nothing in my position that would permit a firing squad just executing an innocent family for any or no reason. It's easy to deny intrinsic worth. It's easy to deny objective moral values and duties. At the end of the day, you're not going to be able to consistently live your life that way. So I don't take arguments like there is no intrinsic value, there is no intrinsic worth. I don't take arguments like those seriously because the bottom line is it has no basis in reality. It just doesn't work in reality. The source of arguments people like those are giving, or the source of arguments that evil regimes use to justify mass genocide. So take folks seriously when they say intrinsic worth doesn't exist, when intrinsic value doesn't exist, because when you get finished, you're not going to be able to live your life that way. We don't sit up here and make these considerations and these sorts of arguments when we see something bad happening on the street corner to somebody and like, well, I could call the police. I could decide not to call the police. But there's really no reason for me to call the police or not call the police because value in isn't inherent. Value is doesn't exist. I'll just be like, well, hey, I'll just go on about my days, not really a big deal. People don't act like I like well I don't know each and every person, but I highly doubt most people act like this in their real life. We don't sit around and make these arguments in our reality. These I am convinced that these sorts of nonsensical arguments are mainly put here on the internet for people to try to win arguments. There's really nothing sound. There's really nothing which uh, sits well in reality with these with this position. There's really not much more I can say on this, but I'm gonna go ahead and end this hangout. Thanks for listening, folks. Have a good day. Take it easy and God bless.